on the 20th century, the CIA.
You think your father was killed by the CIA?
That's what I think, yes.
50 years of spying.
We deserted men, and we left them to languish as POWs.
The triumphs.
Intelligence, I think, really helped keep the superpowers away from one another's throats.
And the tragedies.
10 people were executed as a result of his performance.
I'm Mike Wallace, and this is the 20th century. In September 1997, the Central Intelligence Agency observed its 50th birthday. That milestone normally calls for celebration, and the CIA did in fact take advantage of it to call attention to its achievements in helping to win the Cold War. But as it turned 50, the CIA was going through its own version of a midlife crisis. And of all the problems the agency had to confront in its golden anniversary year, none was more demoralizing than the disclosure of treachery within its elite corps of intelligence officers.
Harold Nicholson is now being held without bond. He is the highest-ranking CIA officer ever accused of spying for the Russians. Among other things, he is believed to have revealed the identities of CIA officers who now cannot serve overseas because of the danger both they and their contacts would be in.
In March of 1997, Nicholson pled guilty to espionage charges, and his case was more than a rare embarrassment since it was all too reminiscent of the Aldrich Ames scandal 3 years earlier.
Justice Department officials today charged Aldrich Ames and his wife Rosario with spying on America for the Russians. Ames was arrested on his way to his job at the CIA, where he has worked for 31 years.
Ames blew the entire network of Soviets secretly working for this country. One by one, their best Soviet agents, their best spies from within Soviet society began to disappear.
10 people were executed as a result of his performance. The main problem is what it does for your reputation. If you go to another Russian and ask him to spy for you, what's he going to say? No, you can't keep me safe, you can't keep my secret.
Doing the country's secret work in silence is what the CIA has always been about. And if the agency now seems beleaguered by public failures like the Ames case, that was not true at its beginning. It was born cocky, maybe even arrogant, in the confident era immediately after the Allies' sweeping victory in World War II. Fact is, the CIA can trace its origins to the early years of that war. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor did not surprise all Americans. Some in military intelligence had had clues of the attack days before, but there was no effective way to coordinate those scattered reports. One analyst recalled, "We just didn't have an intelligence system." So within months, the Office of Strategic Services, or OSS, was born, headed by William Wild Bill Donovan, a World War I hero turned lawyer. And America's first full-fledged spy agency helped win World War II. Victory in Europe brought wild rejoicing throughout the Allied world. At war's end, President Truman disbanded the OSS, but 2 years later, as the United States and the Soviet Union became embroiled in the Cold War, the spy operation was reborn with a different name, the Central Intelligence Agency.
And this is how it all began, back in 1947. A spy agency collecting intelligence on the Russians. But in the late 40s, it was decided that information was not enough. CIA agents would carry out secret operations known as covert actions throughout the world.
We were the firemen that went out around the world putting out fires. And I think that Americans are fix-it people. And we were convinced that we could fix the world.
We were in what it's become fashionable to call the Cold War, and it was very easy to classify individuals and political parties and certain governments as being the bad guys, others as our allies, the good guys.
In 1951, one of the so-called bad guys was Mohammad Mossadegh, Prime Minister of Iran under the 32-year-old Shah of Iran. The Shah had been installed as head of state by the British.
At the time, the Shah was sympathetic to the West, but his hold on the government was shaky. He controlled elements of the army, but not his prime minister, Mohammad Mossadegh. Mossadegh had offended the West by nationalizing the oil fields.
Oil again poses a threat to peace, and the Middle East again becomes a trouble spot.
Premier Mossadegh also legalized Iran's Communist Party, and that was enough to trigger a coup in Iran in 1953, instigated by the CIA.
I think the most compelling reason for the coup was the desire to have that oil available at favorable prices for the so-called free world.
And the threat of communism, the threat of Soviet
The threat of
domination.
communism, I think, was more of a rationalization for going ahead.
The CIA smuggled Kermit Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt's grandson, into Iran to foment the coup. By spreading around a still undisclosed sum of money, some said millions, he convinced royalist supporters, with the help of the army, to pull off a coup d'etat that dumped Mossadegh and returned the Shah to the peacock throne.
Former Premier Mossadegh's ruined house is a mute testimony to 3 days of bloody rioting, culminating in a military coup from which the one-time dictator of Iran fled for his life. The Shah, who had fled to Rome, comes home. Iranian oil may again flow westward.
In the months following the 1953 coup in Iran, the White House and the CIA were running 48 major covert actions.
Among them, the overthrow of Jacobo Arbenz, the newly elected president of Guatemala. Along with the fear of Soviet influence in the Western Hemisphere, Arbenz's government itself was seen as a real threat to a major American corporation.
The whole country of Guatemala was once virtually a branch office of the United Fruit Company. In the 1950s, it held 2/3 of the usable farmland and monopolized the nation's railroad in its multi-million-dollar banana empire.
And when that empire was threatened, the CIA acted.
Arbenz had legalized the Communist Party, taken over an American-owned United Fruit Company plantation, and he was moving toward land reform. Anti-Arbenz demonstrators suddenly filled the streets of Guatemala City. Small bands of rebels were provided arms by the CIA. The leader of the opposition forces was said to have only a few hundred followers, but CIA broadcasts announced that large rebel forces were converging on Guatemala City. It was the big lie, and it worked. President Arbenz panicked. He resigned and fled the country.
There was one time when we had a very desperate situation, or we thought it was at least, in Central America, and we had to get rid of a communist government which had taken over.
But rearranging governments in third world countries turned out to be a relatively easy part of the CIA's mission. A far greater challenge was penetrating the Iron Curtain. The solution to the problem of getting in there was the brainchild of Richard Bissell, who would go on to become a legendary figure as chief of the CIA's covert operations. In 1954, he put together a team that created the U-2, America's first spy plane.
It's a plane designed for one specific purpose, reconnaissance, a 20th century form of espionage, photographing the ground from high altitudes, recording other military data on electronic instruments.
Known as the Black Lady of Espionage, it could fly at 70,000 feet, supposedly beyond the range of any Soviet anti-aircraft missile. It was hailed as the greatest intelligence breakthrough of the century.
In 1956, when we had been overflying for about a year, Gromyko at the United Nations talked to John Foster Dulles and said, "You fly over us again, we shoot you down." And Dulles said, "Well, why don't you?" So we flew for 4 years, but then they did.
The Soviets made good on Gromyko's threat in May of 1960, when they shot down a U-2 piloted by Francis Gary Powers.
On display in Moscow, the wreckage of pilot Francis Powers' U-2 reconnaissance plane for Muscovites and foreign newsmen to see.
The State Department tried to claim the Russians had fired on a weather plane that had strayed into their airspace. But then, as part of his propaganda campaign, Soviet Premier Khrushchev put the pilot on display, too.
Do you plead guilty to the charges listed?
Yes, I plead guilty.
Also shot down in the U-2 fiasco was a scheduled East-West summit meeting that promised to reduce Cold War tensions. Now, instead of taking steps to resolve their differences, the two superpowers reverted to a hard-line posture of mutual hostility. In the aftermath of the U-2 incident, Washington and Moscow moved inexorably toward the most dangerous confrontation of the entire Cold War. And a major player in the perilous events of the early 1960s was the CIA. Crisis in Cuba when the 20th century continues.